I spent 9 years saving for my condo. Let me be honest with you about what those 9 years actually looked like. Missed vacations, the same aging Civic held together by optimism and careful oil changes, meal prep every Sunday, because spending $15 on a takeout lunch felt like a small betrayal of the plan. And then my parents showed up on Thanksgiving weekend with 4 suitcases and the quiet certainty that the second bedroom was already theirs. But before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. What would you do if the family you had spent your entire adult life quietly keeping afloat arrived at your front door? Not for dinner, but for good, and simply assumed that your home was now part of a plan nobody had bothered to tell you about. That is what happened to me. My name is Lara, and at 32, I had finally bought a 2-bedroom condo in Scarborough that I had worked years to afford. What came next changed the way I understand family, love, and what it actually means to have somewhere that belongs entirely to you. I grew up in London, Ontario, in a house that always felt a little too crowded and a little too stretched. My parents worked hard and they raised 3 children on a budget that required constant adjustments. I was the oldest. I learned early that being the oldest meant being the responsible one, which in my family had slowly, over the years, become a synonym for being the one who solved problems. When I was 23, I moved to Toronto for my nursing degree. I remember sitting in my first apartment, a basement unit in North York, that smelled like someone else's cooking, and thinking that this was the beginning of something entirely mine. I had a plan. Work, save, travel a little, and a condo maybe. Nothing grand, just mine. Then my parents called. My younger brother had been accepted to Western University, which should have been purely good news. It was, mostly. Except my parents explained that they were short for his first semester tuition and residence fees. Just a loan, my mother said. We'll pay it back when things settle down. I was making $38,000 a year as a new graduate nurse. I sent the money anyway because he was my brother, and I told myself that was what you did. One semester became another, then another. My brother graduated 4 years later. He never once mentioned the money. I had stopped tracking the total by then. I told myself it didn't matter. When I was 26, my parents' furnace died in the second week of January. If you have never experienced a furnace failure in a southern Ontario winter, let me explain what that means. Temperatures were sitting below -20 that week, and my parents had no backup heat and nothing left in savings to cover the repair. The quote came back at just over $6,000. I remember standing in the hospital parking lot after a 12-hour overnight shift, reading the text on my phone, doing the math. I sent the money. My mother said, "That's just what family does." I believed her then. At 28, my sister got engaged. The wedding was genuinely beautiful, and I mean that without bitterness. But somewhere in the planning, costs began drifting toward me. My parents contributed what they could, which was modest, and my sister had her heart set on a venue that cost more than 2 months of my rent. When I hesitated for half a second, my mother said something I have not forgotten. She said, "You don't have children to save for yet." I smiled and wrote the e-transfer, but something shifted in me that day, because I finally started asking myself a question I should have asked years earlier. When was it going to be my turn? Around that time, I met the man who would later become my husband. He was steady and observant, and good at noticing things I had trained myself not to see. He never told me to stop helping my family. He just asked me one evening, over dinner, without making a big thing of it, "Lara, when you need something, who do you call?" I didn't have an answer. I sat with that question for a long time afterward. A few weeks later, I opened a TFSA at a different financial institution than the one my parents knew about. I stopped announcing every raise at work. I stopped explaining where my money went. I started treating my savings like a promise I was making to myself, and for the first time in my adult life, I was actually keeping it. I didn't know then that those contributions would eventually become the down payment on my condo, but they did. The Toronto market was punishing. I lost 2 offers before one was finally accepted. I remember sitting in my car after the second loss, staring at the steering wheel, seriously asking myself whether I was foolish for believing this was still possible. I kept going. Eventually I found a 2-bedroom unit in a mid-rise building in Scarborough. The kitchen was smaller than I wanted. The view was a parking structure. But the building was quiet, the maintenance fees were manageable, and when I stood in the empty living room during the showing, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time: peace. My offer was accepted on a Thursday afternoon. When my husband called me with the confirmation, I cried in the hospital parking lot for 10 minutes before I could drive home. I had actually done it. The first people I called were my parents. My mother's very first question was, "How many bedrooms?" I laughed because I assumed she was joking. She was not. My father followed it up by saying, "Good. There'll be room for everyone at the holidays." Something about the way he said it, not "we'd love to visit," not "maybe we'll come see it," but "there'll be room for everyone," as though the second bedroom had already been scheduled into someone's calendar, gave me a small, uncomfortable feeling that I quickly brushed aside. I told myself I was being too sensitive. I was happy, and I did not want to spoil it by searching for problems where there weren't any. I moved in that spring. I chose every piece of furniture carefully. I painted the walls a soft gray white that looked different in the morning light than it did in the evening, and I liked that it changed. I set up the second bedroom as a proper guest room, a real bed, a good duvet, a lamp that actually worked. It was meant for visitors, someone who stayed for a weekend and went home. I never imagined that anyone would look at it and see something permanent. When Canadian Thanksgiving approached in early October, I decided to do something I had never done before: host. For years, Thanksgiving had always meant driving down to London. This year, I sent a message to everyone: "Thanksgiving weekend at my place, so excited to finally have you here." I stared at that message after sending it and smiled. I thought I was inviting my family into my new life. I had no idea they were already making plans for it without me. Everyone responded enthusiastically. My mother said she would bring her sweet potato dish. My father asked about visitor parking. My brother said he would arrive Saturday afternoon. My sister mentioned that her husband would probably come too. Nothing sounded unusual. So when I opened my front door on the Saturday morning and found my parents standing in the hallway, with 4 large suitcases and 2 carry-on bags, I was confused before I was anything else. I stepped back. My mother rolled one of the large cases across my hardwood floor, as though she had been doing it for years. She smiled and said, "We sold the house, sweetheart, we're here now." I looked at the suitcases. I looked at her. I could not make the sentence compute. They had sold the house in London. 2 weeks earlier, she told me when I finally asked. They had finalized the sale and never said a word to me because, according to my mother, there was no point worrying me before everything was settled. My father sat down on my couch, the one I had spent 3 weekends researching, and said that my brother and sister were on their way too, and that we all needed to sit down and talk about arrangements. That word. I asked what he meant. He looked genuinely puzzled that I needed clarification. "Where everyone's going to stay," he said. I felt the room shift. I said, as calmly as I could, that I had invited everyone for Thanksgiving dinner. I had not invited anyone to move in. My father frowned. He said I had plenty of space. My mother said they hadn't expected me to turn them away at my own door. And before I could respond, a car pulled into the visitor lot below, and I watched through the window as my brother and then my sister and her husband climbed out, each of them carrying bags. Not overnight bags. Real ones. Nobody asked which room to use. They were already discussing it in the hallway. I excused myself and sat on the edge of the bathtub with the door locked and the fan running, because I needed somewhere quiet. I could hear them on the other side of the wall, moving through my apartment with the ease of people who had already decided it was theirs. I told myself we would have dinner, and then we would talk, and surely they would understand. They did not understand. After the dishes were cleared, my father leaned back in the chair I usually sat in and said we needed to have a conversation. My brother and sister were already seated. My sister's husband sat with his arms crossed. It felt less like a family dinner and more like a meeting someone else had called, and I had walked into accidentally. My father explained that a business investment he had made 2 years earlier had gone very badly. He had lost a significant portion of his retirement savings. What he said next made the back of my neck go cold. My brother had been the one to recommend the investment. My father offered this without any visible blame, just the flat recitation of a fact. Then my brother cleared his throat and said that I was in the strongest position now, steady income, a condo with equity, space, and that it would make sense for the family to consolidate for a while until things stabilized. I thought I had misunderstood him. Consolidate. I asked him to explain what he meant. He said it meant my parents needed a place to stay while they sorted out their finances, and that my sister and her husband could use the second bedroom as a base while they looked for something in the city. I looked around my living room, my furniture, my walls, my home, and my family was sitting in it, calmly dividing it among themselves. I tried to explain that owning a condo did not mean having unlimited resources. I had a mortgage, Condo fees, hydro, property tax. I was not a solution to a problem I hadn't created, my mother sighed. Then she said, "We didn't raise you to be selfish." That sentence had worked on me for years. I had heard versions of it since I was in my 20s, and it had always made me back down, agree to things I didn't want to agree to, transfer money I couldn't easily spare. But something was different that night. I was not being selfish. I was saying no. There is a difference. Even if my family had never been willing to acknowledge it. Then my father said something casually, the way someone mentions they changed the oil in their car, that made me go completely still. He had updated his address with the Canada Revenue Agency. His new mailing address for his CRA account. He had listed my condo. Done it a few weeks earlier, around the time the house sale finalized. Before Thanksgiving. Before he had told me a single thing. I excused myself, went to the kitchen, and stood at the sink with the cold tap running and the water going over my hands because I needed something real and grounding. Behind me, I could hear my family resume the conversation without me. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark and thought about the CRA detail. It wasn't careless. Careless would have been giving someone the wrong postal code. He had deliberately logged into a government account and changed his official address to mine. He had done it before he arrived, before he told me anything. The next morning, while my mother rearranged my kitchen cabinets, because she had decided the layout wasn't practical, I opened my laptop and pulled up my credit file through Equifax Canada. I had checked it regularly over the years while saving for the mortgage. I knew exactly what it should look like. There was a hard inquiry I didn't recognize, dated 6 weeks earlier, a consumer lending application from a major bank. My name appeared in the file as a co-applicant reference. My condo address was listed. The application for a car loan had been declined. I read the entry 3 times. My hands were not steady when I called the bank's fraud and identity line. After I verified my information, I explained what I had found. The representative confirmed that an application had been submitted and that my name and address appeared in the co-applicant documentation. She could not name the applicant for me, but she confirmed that I had never provided authorization for my information to be used in this way. She flagged the account, recommended I place a fraud alert on my credit profile, and told me to follow up with a written statement. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after I hung up. Then I called my husband. He was at work. He listened to everything without interrupting once. When I finished, he asked me the kind of question he had always been good at. Simple, direct, the kind that cuts straight through to what you already know. He said, "Lara, if this was happening to someone you loved, what would you tell her to do?" I knew the answer. I had always known the answer. I had just never applied it to myself before. A few days later, my phone rang. It was my mother's older sister, my aunt, who lives in Ottawa. Someone I hadn't spoken to properly in almost 2 years. My mother had been calling relatives. It turned out, describing me as cold and ungrateful and unwilling to help the people who had sacrificed for me. My aunt had heard the version of the story where I was the problem. But she didn't call to lecture me. She asked if she could tell me something she had never told me before. She said that years ago, when my parents were first getting established and trying to find their footing, a close family friend had agreed to take them in temporarily. 1 month became 3. 3 became 6. Nearly a full year passed. The friend came home one evening to find that my mother had reorganized his entire kitchen, and that my father had lent the visitor parking spot to a relative without asking. By the end, the friend had to go through a formal process, filing with the landlord and tenant board, to reclaim his own space. He and my parents never spoke again. I asked my aunt why she had never told me any of this. She said she thought I would figure it out myself. That phone call changed something in me that I hadn't been able to shift on my own. For years, I had asked myself if I was the problem. Too rigid, too possessive, too unwilling to do what family was supposed to do. But I was not the first person my parents had done this to. I was simply the newest one. And apparently, I was the first who had said no. The following week, I contacted a real estate tenant law firm through my hospital's employee assistance program. My lawyer listened carefully, asked precise questions, and then reviewed everything I brought her. The Equifax inquiry, the CRA address change, a sequence of text messages my parents had sent in the weeks before Thanksgiving that, read in order, made clear this had been planned before they ever loaded the car. She told me that because my parents had been receiving mail at my address and had been present for more than a few weeks, I needed to follow the formal process rather than simply asking them to go. Document everything, she said. Be patient. Do not let emotion drive the timeline. I did exactly that. I created a folder, dates, screenshots, text messages, financial records, the bank's written confirmation of the unauthorized inquiry. I kept a digital copy and a printed copy, and I carried the printed one with me. My mother found it one Sunday afternoon. She picked it up from the counter, looked at the first page and asked what it was. I didn't answer right away. She kept reading. Her expression changed. "You're keeping records on your own mother now?" she said. I looked at her and said, "I'm protecting my home." She walked away. But that evening my brother found me alone in the kitchen. His voice was different from the family meeting. Quieter, slightly ashamed. He said he hadn't meant to make things harder. He apologized briefly for how everything had unfolded. And then came the real question. He asked, very quietly, whether I was really going to make them all leave in November. There it was again. The guilt, arranged carefully like a piece of furniture no one had asked permission to move. This time it didn't shift me. My lawyer prepared a formal written notice, a notice requiring vacant possession, and served it on my behalf with the required timeline under Ontario's residential tenancy framework. When I handed my parents their copy, my hands were completely steady. My mother stared at the paper. My father said nothing at all. I turned and walked to my bedroom and closed the door. For the first time, my family had a deadline that could not be negotiated away with tears. The atmosphere in the apartment changed. My parents stopped pretending it would somehow resolve itself. My mother moved to a new strategy. She began calling extended family. Within days, I received messages from people I had not heard from in years. Cousins I had met maybe twice. Relatives who had no context for any of this, and had been given only one side of it. But my aunt called again. She told me that the same people my mother was now reaching out to were the ones who had stayed silent years ago, when that family friend had needed support. She told me not to wait for them to understand. She told me to finish what I had started. I gathered everything onto my dining table one evening and looked at it. The Equifax printout, the bank's written confirmation, the CRA correspondence, my aunt's account of what had happened before. Then I walked to the living room. I placed the credit inquiry document on the coffee table without preamble and told them exactly what the bank had confirmed. That an application had been submitted. That my name appeared without my knowledge or consent. That this had happened 6 weeks before Thanksgiving, before they had told me anything about selling the house. My father said they had intended to tell me. I asked when exactly that had been the plan. He did not answer. My mother said I was making it sound worse than it was. She reached for the sentence she had relied on throughout my adult life. "After everything we've done for you." And I let her say it, and then I told them about my aunt's story. The family friend. The 11 months, the landlord and tenant board. The silence that came after. The room went very still. My brother looked at my mother. My sister looked at the floor. Whatever unified front my parents had walked into my apartment with on Thanksgiving weekend had come apart completely. I said what I should have said years before. I told them I was not the family bank. I said that my condo was not collateral for anyone else's decisions, including my own. My own mistake being that I had stayed quiet for so long and let guilt make the choices that should have been mine. My mother cried. My father became formal and stiff. I did not raise my voice once. They moved out on a Wednesday in late November. My father gave me a stiff handshake at the elevator. My mother did not look at me when she left. I stood in the hallway and listened to the elevator descend, and then I went back inside and sat in the quiet of my apartment. My brother stayed a few minutes longer than the others. He stood near the doorway and looked around the apartment. My furniture, my walls, the guest room that had never been anyone's permanent room. And then he turned to me and said, "I should have asked you what you wanted." It wasn't a complete apology. It didn't account for everything. But he wasn't asking me for anything, and for my brother, that was something new. 3 days later, my sister sent me a message. Short, without excuses. She said she was sorry for assuming the second bedroom was available to her and her husband. I read it twice. I didn't know then what our relationship would look like going forward. I still don't know entirely, and I've learned to be honest about that, rather than forcing an answer. The following October, my husband and I hosted a small Thanksgiving dinner. 4 close friends, a table that wasn't crowded with unspoken arrangements, food that everyone brought without it meaning anything other than that they wanted to. There was laughter that didn't require any effort. At one point, I got up to check whether a friend's cab had arrived, and I walked to the front door. I stood there for a moment with my hand on the lock. I thought about that first Thanksgiving weekend. My mother rolling her suitcase across my floor. My father sitting in my chair explaining arrangements. The feeling that my own home had shifted underneath me in the span of a single sentence. I turned the deadbolt, heard it click. And I smiled. Not because everything had been resolved cleanly and the family was suddenly fine. Families are rarely that simple, and I have stopped pretending otherwise. I smiled because I finally understood something that had taken me a very long time to learn. Saving money takes discipline and patience and years of quiet work. Saving yourself takes a different kind of courage altogether. I had built this home, and this time I was keeping it. If you were standing at that door when the suitcases arrived, what would you have done? Tell me honestly in the comments. I really want to hear from you.